You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Okay, I'm Peter Boettke, the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason University's Mercatus Center. And I'm here today on Wednesday, May 3rd, 2017. I'm here with Professor Roger Koppl of Syracuse University. He has also spent time with us this year as the F.A. Hayek Distinguished Visiting Professor. Thank you, Roger, for agreeing to spend time with us this year and contribute to our ongoing research and educational programs, and thanks for agreeing for being with me today. Just as some background, can you tell us a bit about how you got interested in these ideas in the first place, your experiences both at NYU and Auburn as a graduate student in the 1980s?
Sure, I'd be only too happy to. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed my visit with the Mercatus Center so much, and I'm real happy to be here today. Well, I got started on this, I suppose, like most folks, as an undergraduate. I got interested in economics. This was the late 70s, and economics was taught in the main in most places, as at Cleveland State University, where I was an undergraduate, in just an abysmal manner. It was everything happened on the blackboard. There were no people. I remember vividly my first economics course, which in those days was Introduction to Macroeconomics, and they drew the Keynesian cross on the blackboard in those days. And somehow, because the instructor had drawn those two lines on the board, that caused the intersection of those two lines to be where the economy would go. I couldn't figure that out. But I had also to take the second course, but it was interesting stuff anyway. And then I had also to take the second course, which in those days was microeconomics. And I was hooked. That I could understand. At the same time, they still had the equation disease. So I could see human action like a ghost behind all those microeconomic relations. But I couldn't see human action in those microeconomic relations. And a visiting philosopher named Roger Breyer told me that there's these guys called the Austrians, and I should check them out. And I read Israel Kirzner's The Economic Point of View and was knocked out. This was it, because he was doing economics, which I had learned to love and hate somehow at the same time. He was doing economics as if there were people in it. And that was it. I was sold. And very luckily for me, NYU admitted me. I went to NYU, studied under some of the real giants of the profession and of the Austrian branch of the profession. And nothing's been the same since. It's been great.
It is very enlightening, I think, for young people to try to remember that it wasn't that long ago when you taught macro before you taught micro.
Yeah.
It's a key idea of the Keynesian revolution that changed thought, that you couldn't have microeconomic laws unless the macroeconomy was in balance. Yeah. Otherwise, the system would be haywire. And that all switched in the 80s, and nowadays they don't have that, but it sort of seems like it's coming back a bit after the financial crisis. And so it's important, I think, to go back and stress that idea of the micro foundations, and maybe we'll come back to that in a little bit. But I did want to ask...
You're right. They totally made microeconomics a special case that applies in the special situation, which we're not going to have unless the economic experts are in charge manipulating the levers in just the right way. Yeah. Otherwise, there is no microeconomic theory. Yeah. It was shocking to think back on that.
Yeah. It's hard. It's important to remember the bathtub.
Yes, right.
And
you should explain what you mean when you say that.
But not everyone gets access to it. But if you go to Google and you type in the Phillips machine, you can see it, which was a bathtub, but it had the leakage was savings, which is the drain, and then you had the hot water and the cold water could be fiscal policy and monetary policy, and the point was to maintain the tub at precisely the full employment levels of output. And it was a great illustration of what they had in mind but also who was turning the levers, right, and whatnot. Because but it is a
Yeah, if you Google, that's right. You know, the textbooks literally had pictures of bathtubs in them. It's so funny. And there was really a moniac computer, which was a series of chambers and sluices through which water moved. And this was considered to be it was an analog computer, and it was considered to be an adequate model of the macroeconomy, of the overall system. And it's relatively simple. If you go to YouTube and you Google moniac, you should be able to find a beautiful video that's on YouTube of the moniac computer in action.
Yeah.
It's very impressive in many ways. Ed Phelps was the creator of that.
Yeah, I love Mary Morgan's book, The World in a Model, because it goes through the various different uses that models have among economists in the history of the discipline. And there was an idea where models were representations. They were built as machines. I mean, going back to some of your early work in history of economic ideas, there's a connection to the idea of the circularization of the system in the is that Turgot, right? I think, or who is it that did the bloodstream or whatever? And
well, I mean that's the physiocrats, among whom Turgot was one of the early followers.
Yeah. So they have all that idea. All right, let's get back to your NYU period, because as you mentioned briefly in your education, you had this fantastic opportunity not only to study with Israel Kirzner, and I want to ask you some questions about that, but at NYU you had the great opportunity to be introduced to the old world. That is through Fritz Machlup and Ludwig Lochmann. I think for those of us who have known you for a long time, we would say that you, in fact, have the best impression of Ludwig Lochmann in the history of modern economic thought. We don't need to go down there here, but I would love to hear the window in which these professors opened up to you, to the old Vienna and to the London School of Economics during, as what Shackle calls, the years of high theory, which is where Lochmann was at. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I understand you. But my Lochmann imitation has been permanently retired. But I will...
the singer for Journey. So we now have to go worldwide and find a replacement.
I will brag that I did indeed have the world's best Lochmann impression. I will allow myself that vain boast. Machlup was both these guys, of course, were very important. And one of the things that they did for a young scholar trying to sort of reach the shelf is they showed him what the level is. You can't, there's no substitute for that. Machlup was the real deal. He was a scholar. He was one of the important minds of the 20th century. And there's no algorithm, there's no recipe, there's no formula to write down, what I learned from that. But there's also no substitute for seeing that level of scholarship in action, to seeing that kind of a mind in action. So that was very important, just to know what the level is. So that was very helpful. Lochmann was extraordinary and wonderful. There's sort of two things about Lochmann that I would want to talk about. He said he was your equal. He was not your teacher and anything like a young person often thinks of the teacher, some authority figure, and you got to take notes and you better be right. Lochmann, in spite of all his very gentlemanly, old worldly manners, totally gave off the idea, we're a couple of equals, we're trying to understand the world, let's sit down together and figure it out. This was hugely empowering for a young graduate student. And then he had a club, which was also hugely empowering. Although I have to say there's the plus and a minus on that. The club was expectations. He had this problem, subjective expectations. And this problem was just not addressed in the economics of the time. It was a dead issue. So that meant if you picked up his club, you could beat anybody with it. Any speaker come to the NYU seminar, you could pick up the club that says expectations, just beat them with it, and you didn't even have to know anything. So it was hugely empowering. But, of course, it was also a danger, because then the danger was that you would substitute this, invocation of a problem, we have to think about expectations, for actually analysis of the world. So you have to outgrow that. and figure out how to solve problems and not just beat people with a club. But there was a time when I had that club in hand and was just unreflectively beating people with it. And I have to admit, I still look back on that with pleasure because it was somehow empowering, and it was shaping for me because it put the problem in my head and put me under an obligation to think seriously about it and not just gripe about the fact that there's this big problem expectations we have to deal with.
Yeah, I want to just push you a little bit on Mocklup a little bit because so I get the point about quality of minds. It's actually inspiring when you think about the quality of minds that were in the Mises seminar in the 1920s, because you have to throw in there not only Hayek and Mocklup, but also Morgenstern, Haberler, Schutz, Felix
Vogelin.
Yeah,
Felix Kaufmann's a great
Felix
name. I'm so glad you named that name.
So, you know,
If I may interrupt,
yeah.
Kaufmann is the guy behind Robbins' 31 essay.
Right.
Right. It's when we read in the textbooks, as we did universally back in the 80s and 70s and so on, that economics is the science of the allocation of scarce resources. Think Felix Kaufmann.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. I found in the LSE archives, and I hope I'll be doing a paper with this with Emily Scarbeck, because she was with me when we found it, the appendix that Robbins never put in the first edition. And it's a philosophical appendix, and it deals with all these different people. Because Robbins was very fluent in German, so he was very deeply knowledgeable of that. His connection to Mises goes all the way back into the early 20s, and he's tried to translate Mises's book Socialism into English and was arranging for that. But he also got completely enamored with Mises, the person, but also his ideas. And the appendix is all about his defense of Mises, and it's very similar to the kind of arguments that one would read in Mocklup, which is more of a pragmatic position rather than a transcendental a priorism, and but it's put in very common sense language, which Robbins had going for him as a writer. And so I'm hoping to make a kind of a little mini splash in our community with this essay, because he says at one point, he says, if a priorism means this, and then he goes through the extreme interpretation, he goes, clearly Professor Mises wouldn't want to mean that, you know. And then he goes on. Yeah. So it's a very fascinating thing. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about Mocklup and the behavioralist debate, because one of your early essays with Richard Langlois tries to straighten out the interpretation on Mocklup in a very persuasive way. It changed the way I thought about these things, because Mocklup is often presented to economists as a defender of neoclassical economists and the as-if.
Yeah.
And you explain the more subtle interpretation of Mocklup. And I'm wondering if that isn't also something that needs to be done today in the modern behavioral debates, to come back to that same kind of idea, the focus on the filter and rules of thumb and whatnot in decision making.
I think that's a great remark and a great question. Yeah, Mocklup was a follower of Alfred Schutz, another great member of the Mises Circle, and later a professor of sociology at the New School. And with that Schutzian background, Mocklup was very clear. Your models have to say things about people that would be understandable and recognizable, intelligible to the real people in a real situation. So this is a kind of a check on your model. Can you tell me what your model says about what real people in the real situation would do? And once we've got, if not, then your model is correspondingly incoherent. And if so, is it plausible? Is it intelligible? Would it be sensible to those people? So this is something missed in Mocklup's defense of neoclassical economics. That's exactly right. Consider his, the so-called Mocklup-Lester debate, where he criticizes the use made by two scholars whose names I'm forgetting, the survey literature,
Uh-huh.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So these guys went out and like asked businessmen basically,
Do you marginal cost price?
do you marginal cost price? They said marginal what, right?
Yeah.
And so they said, well, see, we've totally falsified neoclassical economics. And Mocklup made the point, wait a minute, read the even just the write-up of this report, and what do you see? People saying things, oh, we do a markup, but of course the markups will be tighter in periods of brisk demand and so on. He's saying, look, that's totally marginalism. Yeah. So this is a great strength of, and what people got out instead of the Mocklup Lester debates was that we shouldn't ask the subjects what's going on,
right?
Which is
so
absolutely the wrong.
Out. Yeah. The exact
absolutely
opposite.
the wrong lesson. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you're right. Now, behavioralism and nudging and all this stuff today, right? It's absolutely there. It's making a comeback. And you're right. We need to translate the sort of old Mocklup critique to this new literature. We have to make the translation. We can't just point to Mocklup and say he got it. But it does seem to me that a lot of times this kind of behavioralist, Kahneman and Tversky stuff, it imagines that we the theorists, we're real smart, and these louts that are actual actors in the economy are not smart, and we're smarter than they are, right? So they're getting along with a simplified robotic model of the agent that's not actually intelligible to the real people in the real situation. So we have to figure out how to bring that intelligibility criterion into the new literature. That's right.
So I think, again, that's a very insightful idea that explains why Mocklup tried to devote a fair amount of time to methodology, was precisely because he was trying to fit in between the scientific fads of the time and yet get the intelligibility in there. So what Caldwell calls scientific subjectivism, kind of idea. And you see this in one of his really creative essays called "What If Matter Could Talk," which I wish that more economists read today. So, all right, let's move on. But with a very strong recommendation, everyone should spend some time with Fritz Mocklup and getting to know his
if I
his
can
ideas.
Just tag on a comment on it. I mean, Mocklup was correctly recognized as a neoclassical economist, as a marginalist and therefore a neoclassical economist. He was also totally a Schutzian and Misesian. And I think a lot of times that seems like a contradiction to people. When you dive into that literature, when you dive into Mocklup and understand why that's not a contradiction, I think you're smarter about Austrian economics, you're smarter about neoclassical economics, and you're smarter about the whole history of economics, especially microeconomics, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah, no, that's endorse that completely. At NYU, before we get to your move to Auburn, you also had the great opportunity to be exposed to Israel Kirzner and to Bill Baumol.
Yeah.
And you have, throughout your career, contributed various times to the field of entrepreneurship. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that early exposure to these figures, who in many ways are towering theoretical figures in that modern literature, influenced you in the way that you think about those problems.
Kirzner is the bigger influence here. Baumol is a great influence as well, although not because of any interactions I happened to have had with him when I was a student at NYU. I had a great class in microeconomics with them. It was fabulous. So I really profited from those interactions. But they didn't shape my thinking on entrepreneurship. His JPE, Journal of Political Economy, 1990 article on productive and unproductive entrepreneurship was an influence. It's a basic piece of the architecture for entrepreneurship scholars today, intellectual architecture for them. So that's a huge contribution, and that influences all of us who work in the area. Kirzner was hugely important, and it's really that same sort of human action point with Kirzner, that we're talking about people. And what people do that robots do not do is they learn. Kirzner didn't have the sort of framework, and couldn't have used in his time when he was younger, the framework of algorithmic versus non-algorithmic choice. But you can pretty much capture Kirzner, I think, with that distinction. Are you a robot? Are you engaged in algorithmic choice or not? And if not, what's the thing that's not an algorithm? The thing that's not an algorithm is learning.
Yeah.
Okay? And then the sort of deep insight that Kirzner had is not just, people learn, but that there is this tendency, and it is, of course, only a tendency, to learn what it is in our interest to learn. That's alertness. And you can also find the same alertness with the same label alertness in F.A. Hayek's The Sensory Order.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's a big influence. I think that's not adequately appreciated among entrepreneurship scholars. There is still, I think, some tendency, although weaker than it used to be, for entrepreneurship scholars to want to get somehow the correct recipe, the correct algorithm for how you have a successful business, something like that. Well, wait a minute. If that were a sensible goal, we wouldn't need managers and entrepreneurs.
Right.
We'd let the college professors program their computers and we'd run the system from there. But Kerzner exactly is showing that that's impossible. That's a fantasy of the sort of lowest order. Okay? Trouble with Kerzner within entrepreneurship literature is that people read or pretend to have read his 1973 book, Competition and Entrepreneurship, without reading, much else,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes without reading anything else. And even then they get it wrong. As you know, Pete, and as only a few people adequately appreciate, he's got a totally dynamic vision in the 73 book. But then he takes that sort of dynamic vision of, the learning agent, of the alert entrepreneur discovering new ends means frameworks, and he embeds it within what was then the sort of standard static microeconomic
Right.
model. But why? Because he thinks that was such a swell model? No, to show the orthodox microeconomists of the day that you can't explain equilibration. You can't explain in your own model how equilibrium is possible. You can't not invoke the entrepreneur, the learning, changing homo agens or homo agens, whichever way you pronounce it. So then people look at that and they say, oh, he just had a simultaneous, no time, and that's just a wrong interpretation. And if you read his 81 contribution to the Mises Centenary volume, he's really very clear and explicit about that. That's a rather radical view of dynamic subjectivism that he doesn't get credit for in the economics literature, among even many Austrian economists, and certainly not within the entrepreneurship literature. There's work to be done to make that clear to folks in that literature.
Yeah, I that's a great summary. I also really like the fact that you linked Kerzner's focus on the entrepreneur back to the human action issue. That, of course, goes all the way back to the economic point of view, but it's
That's
also evident in his debate with Becker.
Yes.
And it's also evident, to use a Fritz Machlup student, with Edith Penrose's criticisms about the limits of biological analogies.
Yeah.
She wants to put that creative individual, right, the human being with purposes and plans, at the center. And I think people don't appreciate enough the implications of that, not only for like market theory, but even things like capital theory. So the reason why Kerzner's essay on capital becomes important is precisely because it's about capital maintenance, which is an act of creative entrepreneurship again as well. Yeah. And so it's baked in all the way through as economics, that you have this idea rather than robots, that you have, as you said, learning in these impact. And we have a lot more work to do to take care of that. So I think that's great. Let's move on to your I could sit and talk to you about Kerzner and Machlup for all day long, but I want to get to you also had the great fortune that when you moved to Auburn to finish up your PhD, you got to work with one of the other great thinkers in modern economics, which is Leland Yeager. And Leland Yeager, of course, was one of the core members of the Virginia School at their height with Buchanan and Nutter and Coase. Again, amazing quality of minds that are collected together. But he was a major developer of sort of a version of monetarism in the post-World War II period. And then you got to work with him. And then later on, you edited a volume that's in honor of him as well. And so if you could talk a little bit about your experience with Yeager. Let me just say one other thing. Yeager is also one of these fascinating people who was a technical economist, but also when I started my series on new thinking in political economy, he contributed the very first book, which is Ethics as Social Science.
Yeah.
So he was a very broad thinker. Yeah. He addressed methodological issues, foundational issues in monetary and macro, and across the board. So just talk a little bit about Yeager.
Where do we begin? Yeah, the Festschrift is called Money and Markets, Essays in Honor of Leland Yeager. It's published in 2006, Routledge. And I think if you have any interest in Yeager, it's worth a look. One of the things that happens in that essay is Tulloch tells the story of how he came to Virginia and really emphasizes the formative role of Leland Yeager in not only generally Virginia political economy, but in public choice theory. And he credits Leland with having really lobbied to get Gordon Tulloch a postdoc at Virginia, which then led to his professorship, and with teaching him a lot of economics while he was there. Another sort of current theme in public choice economics is analytical egalitarianism. I think that's there in Yeager's work. Of course, he doesn't use that label, but it's totally there, because what he actually does every time is sort of two things. One thing that we can has sort of two aspects. He models every agent in the system. There's a huge error that we easily make, that we don't model all the agents in the system. In particular, if I'm giving policy advice, I give instructions. Mm-hmm. So there's an agent in the system, the policymaker, that I'm giving orders to, and therefore I don't model that person. Leland never made that mistake. Okay? And so once you make that decision, you have to decide whether I'm going to, and this is the sort of second aspect of the issue, you have to decide, am I going to model that agent as superhuman and above incentives and so on, or as a person like any other? And of course, the question answers itself. You got to model the agent as a person like any other. Okay? So he was there right from the beginning with this concept of analytical egalitarianism, of applying the same economic model of man to the political actors and the market actors in the system. So that's something I think he doesn't quite get enough credit for. What he taught me personally, I went to NYU. I was filled with all this crazy stuff, Verstehende psychology, and K. Menger, the son, Carl Menger's great book on ethics, and all the schutz that I learned from Mocklip and Richard Ebeling and others. So it really was very heady, methodological, philosophical stuff. And from Leland, I learned to not forget about just the details, the straight economics, to not be trapped by the words, the vocabulary, the categories, but to look at, as Leland so eloquently put it, who does what. This is another thing I think he gets inadequate credit for. As you know, Pete, and you're one of the few people I think who recognize it, it was Leland who was first there with the notion that later became identified as the difference between a clean and a dirty float in exchange rates. Well, how did Leland come across that idea? Well, by looking at the details. How precisely, what does it mean to have a floating exchange rate? Too easily, we draw the equations or the graph or whatever, use a few words of vocabulary, and then we're done. You have to peel back those categories and look at what it's saying about who does what. Again, analytical egalitarianism, but you have to be relentless about it. So that's a habit of mine. That's a practice. It's hard to write a recipe or have an algorithm for that. But when you are inculcated by a close work with someone who practices that habit of peeling back the labels and looking at who does what, it really changes how you do your work, and of course in a positive way.
I think that sort of feeds into my next question to you, which is that it was relatively soon after you began your career that you started to make significant headway on projects dealing with expectations. I'm thinking, originally like your work with Bill Butos.
Yeah.
But then in many ways, I would see these as linking Lockman, Mocklip, and Yeager into a kind of an interesting new mix. And I was wondering if you see it that way, or is it just... And if you could maybe talk a bit about the theoretical and practical impact of the work on expectations and how it resulted in your book on big players.
Great. Oh yeah, that'd be great. I think that's right, and it's great that you put Yeager in the mix because he does belong there.
Well, I'm thinking originally your paper on Russia that you did with Jaeger, which actually does invoke the big player model to study the expectations in an empirical way and to see the disturbing aspects of things, right? I mean, this is a kind of, you always had a kind of an unusual take on that, because to some extent, what the way I interpret that early work was you were demonstrating the negative results, right? And as opposed to focusing, but it was an avenue into the literature in money and finance that was intriguing, that was talking on their terms, but opening their eyes to this point eventually that I never saw it before that way, but it really does open their eyes to this analytical egalitarian or behavioral symmetry point. The reason why they're missing it is because they don't have behavioral symmetry. They have there are no big players in their world, right? And so as a result, you don't have them being able to disturb the system. But anyway,
or rather, we are the big players,
right? Yeah,
right. That's the point.
Yes,
right. That we put ourselves in the shoes of the big player, so we're not modeling the big player.
Right.
We're just sort of somehow giving instructions, or imagining ourselves to be somehow running the show. That you got it exactly right. It's that asymmetry of perspectives, that failure of analytical egalitarianism. I think that's exactly right. So the first statement of the theory of big players was indeed the 1995 co-authored paper with Leland. Okay, that's right. So he had a formative role. And again, there's this just sort of the consistent analytical egalitarianism, the consistent peeling away, attention to details. Details matter. I had some ideas that were, sort of head in the clouds, feet dangling off the ground kind of ideas that were inspired by especially Koppl. How do you translate that into really a statement about the world that matters, and an analysis of real events? Without Leland Jaeger's guidance and help, I don't know that I could have made that translation. But we got there, and that's the 95 paper. So he was absolutely vital and formative in that. The problem, the general problem of expectations comes again from Lockman. Okay, he just put his finger on it way back in 1943, and I sort of hate to say it, but he himself, Lockman, I don't think made any real progress on the solution. The guy who gave me the solution was indeed Koppl, and it was another one of his great old papers, Why Bother with Methodology? So Koppl wrote this wonderful paper in 1936 about how methodology matters, and he was talking to economists saying, look, in your models of the world, you're going to have these so-called ideal types, and some are going to be very anonymous, some are going to be non-anonymous. The anonymous ones is when you have many actors acting under a tight system constraint, and so there's just not a lot of scope for them to do something funny or different. We can be confident in the outcome, the actions they'll take. Well, that's the case when you just need an anonymous actor, not a lot of detail about the psychology and personality, nothing like that. Just a little attention to what the basic incentives and constraints are. But if you talk about somebody like a central banker, all of a sudden it matters very much what that person's particular incentives are and crucially, how that person interprets the world. So that's a methodological point. That's a methodological point about what's theory and what's, not theory. What's reliable theory and what's more speculative and conjectural. The sudden insight I had walking down the corridor, I'll tell you, in Thatch Hall in Auburn University, from Leland Jaeger's macroeconomics class to a lecture being given by Richard Langlois, was that we can take that Koppelian methodological framework about more and less anonymous ideal types and translate it into the problem of the economic actor. Because as the rational expectations theorists correctly taught us, as Muth correctly taught us, the economic actor is in essentially the same position as the economic theorist, trying to formulate a model of the world, and that's what expectations is really about. Well, okay, the rational expectations solution is not one attractive to me. The Koppelian solution is that there are ideal types of higher and lower levels of anonymity, that for some of the actors in the system, we got to know how they interpret the world. For others, we don't have to have such a rich picture of how they interpret the world. So that sudden insight to bring the Mark Lip's Why Bother with Methodology down to the level of theory and not methodology, that was my solution to the Lockman problem.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that you didn't talk about it, but I remember reading the paper with Butos, which I think is even earlier than '95, right?
Correct. That's right. That's
yeah.
right. I did neglect that the paper with Butos on expectations does invoke big players. That's back in 1993.
Yeah, and well, the big idea there, at least the way I interpret it in my postcard rendering, right, was that Keynesian policies can create a Keynesian world. And this goes back to the way in which the interaction effect between the sort of policy regime and the expectations of the agents within the regime and how they behave and the interaction among them. And I think that sort of is baked into your analysis that then later gets developed further in the big players as well as in your, I think still, it's kind of funny with timing because your Society for Development of Austrian Economics presidential address gave people an agenda for macroeconomic study that actually had you given that, let's say, in 2009, or whatever, could have, really excited a lot of young people about how to deal with things. But I want to come to
that's a charming thought. I like that.
Yeah, I want to come. Well, I mean, it has had an influence on the whole new young generation of macro Austrians. If you think about Will Luther and other people who are trying to do stuff now, but it nevertheless, it had this whole sort of agenda in it, and part of that was the issue having to do with complexity and computability. And I wanted to push you to see the connections between your work on expectations, your work on big players, and then another strand of your work, which in fact you've been pushing from the beginning, which is on complexity and computability. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and maybe direction of, future research that you see, and how do we really talk about creativity in a complex adaptive system?
Yeah. On the point of creativity, I tend to use the word learning and not creativity. In my work with Stu Kaufman, you come around to the view that the creative element is actually the system and not the agents in the system. So social evolution...
Well, similar to the way you would say rationality is a characteristic of the system, not of the individual agent, because of the filter mechanisms, right? Yeah.
I hadn't seen that parallelism before, but absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, the biological evolution is highly creative. But we don't think, those amoebas had great ideas for how to be something better than an amoeba.
Right.
Right. It's rather that in what Stu Kaufman calls the adjacent possible, certain niches are opened up. And then it's a bit of a chance thing which niches, new biological niches get filled by sort of innovative organisms and which don't. But once that happens, then in what becomes the next adjacent possible, you have a new set of niches and so on. So it's the system that's generating these niches.
And so without the niches, you don't have that entrepreneurial opportunity.
Right.
It just doesn't exist.
So we can imagine, are people creative? Oh, gosh, I don't know. They're creative in the sense that they're able to combine disparate elements together in new and surprising ways, or subdivide existing categories or elements in unexpected ways. Is there some kind of ex nihilo creation in the individual mind? Well, I don't know, maybe. I don't know how to say to prove there isn't or something like that, but I don't need to assume that. I can assume that away and have all the creativity that we actually observe in the social world, just on the idea that the entrepreneur discovers new opportunities in the adjacent possible.
That's where the variation comes.
That's where the variation
and selection comes in a separate,
Yeah, right. And then, so that's where the variation comes from. And then some of those new opportunities are seized upon, or seeming opportunities are seized upon by entrepreneurs. There's a filtering process that determines which ones survive. Okay? And in nowhere do I have to assume that the Kersnerian entrepreneur is creating something ex nihilo. He is, as Kersner, I think, correctly pointed out, making a discovery of an objectively existing opportunity. But the opportunities are endogenous to the system over time.
Yeah. So let me push you back again on this connection between the way that you see. So, in your mind, do you see a link between all your projects over the years, or are these, because I mean, let's just start. So you were very successful early on in your career and published a history of thought, paper in Journal of Economic Perspectives, which captured, some citations, all the professional legitimacy kind of things, right? But there's an argument that you're making in there about what Walras is all about and whatnot, right? And then there's arguments that then are connected to complex systems, issues of computability. This relates also to big players. Part of the reason why you have this constraint in the analytical egalitarianism is precisely because you're not willing to make the omniscient, benevolent point, which would in fact erase computability problems.
That's
right. You're building it, baking it in.
That's
to me, I think there's like a big connection in the Koppl system or worldview.
I think that's correct. Yeah.
But so and also like we're like one of the things that you've done is that we're at George Mason. We have a very fortunate thing here in that we have one of the leading centers for complex adaptive or agent-based models with Rob Axtell.
You've got Rob Axtell, who was a student of Herbert Simon, and sure knows his complexity.
Right, and he with Josh Epstein wrote the sort of main book about the building artificial societies from the bottom up, and we have the Center for Social Complexity, and many of our students that you've interacted with exist in both of these worlds kind of ideas. So I was hoping that maybe you could address future research and impact, but then how is it that rather than that research being just social complexity, that it's Kopplupian?
Right. How is that not just complexity theory? How is it something? How is Koppl? Well, I mean, partly I just, part of my interest in complexity and computability is autonomous. I was an econ math double major as an undergraduate, and read with, at the time, rather dim understanding, the famous paper 1931, Kurt Gödel, which got the whole computability idea going. So I just sort of always knew that was there and important. But then it comes up again with Hayek in a big way. So one of the things that happens is people get into complexity theory. They realize it's important. And by that, normally the idea is it's this so-called Santa Fe complexity. Okay? Complexity theory associated with the Santa Fe Institute, one of whose original promoters was a guy named Kenneth Arrow. This is a very important point in understanding how these pieces all fit together, I think. But what happens? People get into Santa Fe complexity, and then and often, perhaps typically, the idea is this complexity theory is going to give me a fancier slide rule, a better computational power to control the system. I think that's the perspective of an important complexity theorist in the Santa Fe tradition, John Holland. Yeah. But if you recognize the link to Hayek and recognize that Hayek was a complexity theory, as Barclay Rosser does explicitly in his Journal of Economic Perspective survey on complexity theory, now you're in trouble, because Hayek drew the limits of knowledge implications out from complexity theory. And I've seen people travel that road and become much more sort of Austrian in their whole framework, because they couldn't turn away from the Hayekian implications once they engaged Hayek from the complexity point of view. Yeah. It's very powerful stuff. So there's all of that. There's also this.
Let me push you a little bit on this, because this probably goes back also to your NYU experience. So I taught at NYU in the 90s when, after we were in graduate school around the same time. But Jess Ben-Habib was, in fact, at NYU when you were there. And Ben-Habib was one of the original Santa Fe complexity guys. And his models had no connection to human purposefulness going back. Yeah. So I think that there's always was an early battle also between that, because Holland was agent-based models. So they were not, so like if you go back and you look at the original summary discussions, even Kaufman's first book, right, he sort of talks about complexity as getting away from micro foundations. Mm-hmm. Whereas Brian Arthur, and another person who you've been involved with, was in fact also building agent-based kind of models. And he is an example of someone who has become more, I think, Austrian as the time has worn on. Is that a wrong history?
No, I think that's all pretty good. I'm not sure. Maybe you're right that Kaufman was less agent based than.
I'm just
in
talking
the past
about
than
in
now.
the early.
Yeah. That's not a question I've engaged. Maybe you're right. I didn't see that, but perhaps you're right. Of course, my interactions with Kaufman have been in recent years, although I've admired his work, of course, for a long, long time, including, of course, Origins of Order. We should probably distinguish, though, between complexity theory and chaos theory. Some people do, some people don't. I always think we should. I think they're almost the opposites. There's a whole question of the so-called decidability of these things from a kind of computability perspective, and it has been proven that chaos is not decidable, which means there's no characterization of the sort of equation system that's going to let you know if it'll exhibit chaotic behavior ex ante. You just have to let the system unwind and find out.
You would put earlier stuff more in the chaos tradition.
And Benhabib's in the chaos tradition, which I think kind of petered out. It looked like it was a cool tool, but then it didn't seem to take us anywhere. And I think you're exactly right. There was no learning, no agency in those complexity models, in those chaos models, pardon me. It's almost the opposite. With chaos, you have a couple of elements interacting in what looks like a simple way, and then the behavior manifested out from the system is highly chaotic. It's not orderly. With complexity theory, a lot of times the sort of predominant case is that you have many interacting entities that whose interactions are very complicated and hard to follow, and everything is nonlinear, and yet it generates the aggregate behavior for the system, which is highly orderly. So they're almost opposites, right? Few things generating disorder versus many things generating order.
Yeah. No, it's. Let me. Hopefully, maybe you can
tag on this. If
Okay.
I may just quickly tag on this. Part of the thing with computability and complexity both is the point is, can you predict the big player? Can I model the big player as a robot? And the answer is no. And I think complexity theory and computability theory help to demonstrate that the answer is no, has to be no. It's not let's try harder. It's that can't be done.
Yeah. So again, it's another methodological constraint that actually has theoretical and practical implications.
That's right.
On that. That's yeah. So let's bring it back down to like actual applied economics again. Though I hope you'll talk maybe about at some point, feel free to talk about this future direction of research and your interaction with some of the people here that you've had the chance to interact with, and what kind of maybe shape dissertations and stuff could take in that. So, but I want to ask you about the financial crisis. So after the financial crisis, I mentioned already your SDA presidential address, which tried to have a macroeconomics based on bounded rationality, expectations,
rule following,
institutions, and these kind of ideas. But so we get hit with the financial crisis, and you write in my opinion, a wonderful monograph entitled "From Crisis to Confidence." I hope we can provide a PDF of it online for people to read. It's a IEA monograph. But in that, one of the reasons why I found that so fascinating is that, in my opinion, you provide this creative and wonderful synthesis between the monetarism of Irving Fisher, and the explanation of the Great Depression as a debt deflation disease, and the Austrian business cycle theory, which often are presented in contrast with one another. But when I was a student of Hans Sennholz as an undergraduate, and he's as strongly committed Misesian Austrian as you could find, and he had this tremendous impact on me. And I had to memorize his stages of the Great Depression. He wrote a little monograph on the Great Depression, actually before Rothbard's America's Great Depression, that circulated around a lot of people and whatnot. And of course, Rothbard's book became the classic for the new generation of Austrians. And in Rothbard's story, he wants to contrast, just like in Sennholz, monetarism, Keynesianism, and then Austrianism. And so, but when you look at the history, I always thought the Austrians were talking about a different period of time. So they're talking about the 20s. And right, and that's all of Senholz's stages of the issue are all having to do with the 20s and what was going on with monetary policy in the 1920s. Fisher and then later, Milton Friedman, they're talking about 1 to 33. Yeah. So it's a different period of time. No one in the Austrian camp, Rothbard eventually would try to address some of these things. But in the normal Austrian story, you get the credit expansion in the 1920s. But then what you have is, as the way Senholz would talk about it, right, is that you get this trigger point where either the central banker has to continue to try to inflate and risk hyperinflation, or they have to slow down, which then generates these other things. And the way that I always like the way that I really like what you did in this book was you show that the basically this dollar disease and this debt disease are like interacted with one another in this creative synthesis, and
they come from somewhere.
Yeah, and so explain this synthesis, its relevance for the 2008 global financial crisis, and what you think is the future of macroeconomic research and policy coming out of this.
I might be able to say something
in 10 seconds or less.
Yeah, right. I might be able to say something about what the future oughta be.
Yeah,
I don't know what the future will be. I feel some pessimism because macroeconomists are experts who work for states and for international entities and agencies. So they have a vested interest in the existing DSGE framework. I thought that the DSGE framework was really going to lose ground. It has not so much. DSGE stands for Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium. So it's the sort of standard, if you wish, you may say neoclassical macroeconomic model.
Right.
But I think it is up to people who don't want to be president of the World Bank to keep alive a macroeconomic understanding that doesn't support being an expert, but does support understanding the causes of these periodic crises and how they may be prevented. So Fisher has this great story, and it's a story about confidence and about the collapse of confidence. And he makes the point that the thing that really causes harm is when the debt disease and the dollar disease come together. Okay? I think he's right about that. When you have an over-leveraged economy that starts to experience that sort of snowballing of failures, which induces collapse or further collapse, as the case may be, in the money supply. Yeah, that's very destructive. That gets you what Hayek would eventually call the secondary depression. Okay? So I think that's hugely important. But if you read Fisher's 1933 essay laying out this debt deflation theory of crises, it's not quite clear where the gloom comes from that gets it all going, where the lack of confidence, why confidence fails, or why the economy is over-leveraged in the first place. Now, it can just happen sort of organically, technological change that's nothing to do with state policy or anything like that may induce some sort of over-optimism. We remember the tech boom. Now, I think that has to do not only with over-optimism, but also with monetary policy. But still, the tech boom had a big component of just optimism about the new technologies that were happening in those days. So I think that can happen, but it doesn't give us the Great Depression or the Great Recession. It doesn't give us crises of the magnitude that we're talking about when we're talking about macroeconomic policy. So the Austrian theory tells us an important recurrent scenario that does give us a cause for the debt deflation crises that Fisher explained, which is, of course, the monetary expansion driving the market interest rates below their so-called natural or Wickselian levels. So it's like we're filling in the missing original causes for Fisher that he's weak on.
The micro foundations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if they're micro foundations. Actually, they're just the causal foundations.
Yeah.
How do we get in this mess?
The reason
we got in the mess because of bad monetary policy.
Yeah. The reason why I picked that up is that Buchanan, who was a monetarist, nevertheless, in an essay called On Hayek, which is a tribute to Hayek in 1979, he says now that timing is important, 1979, because the Keynesian consensus is breaking down, but yet rational expectations is on the table, but not yet quite there. We also still have Lucas's original islands model, which is a price theoretic, and Buchanan puts his finger on a key issue. He says Hayek is the only theory of the cycle that warrants the name an economic theory. And the reason is because it is a price theoretic story.
Yeah.
And so somehow the pattern of prices gave the wrong signals off that then manifests themselves eventually in the Fisher story. It's to me it's a kind of an interesting debate. Also, you were at Auburn, and so Roger Garrison is a very important figure also in your education. And he had his little debate with Friedman about the plucking model, which again Friedman doesn't have. Like, how Garrison put this is that the data that Friedman is picking up is the trail of the Austrian theory. Right, and so. But we've had a very hard time communicating these ideas, and I thought the way that you did From Crisis to Confidence was one of the best presentations of this.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that remark. Yeah, I think there's one of the reasons that Austrians have had trouble communicating this idea is that we're somehow trying to say, those bad old monetarists, and that's been a terrible error. So, and that's kind of implicit or maybe explicit in your questions. I agree with that hugely. And now we have really an opportunity because we have guys, to name just one name, like William White, who are taking explicitly an interest in Mises and Hayek, the Austrian business cycle theory. I guess I'll name a couple of more names. Axel Lianafud tells an Austrian story of the crisis. It's evident to many persons that the Great Recession is really an Austrian crisis.
I'd throw in Raghu Rajan.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. There's many names. We got Borio. There's other names. So so grab this. If I may allude to Ludwig Lachmann, we should grab this opportunity with both hands. It's there before us. We need to do a better job of it. Some people are in the Austrian tradition working on exactly this point and invoking exactly this literature. We need more of that. We need to grab this opportunity quite aggressively.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think and when the history of Austrian economics in the 20th century gets written, we might look back on that period when Buchanan's talking about in the late 70s as a missed opportunity with Lucas as well.
Yeah.
But then again, you had real business cycle theory, which shifted away from, again, human agency and representative agent models and stuff. But we could go off in a wrong direction on that. So let me go back to my questions here, which is one thing I would say is that I think that the characteristic that has always intrigued or excited us, we didn't go to graduate school together, but we met when we were both in graduate school, is that we were always seeking ways to join a conversation rather than ways to instruct others about why they were wrong and why we're right. And I think that's a kind of that comes from this understanding, I think, of also a shared passion that you and I have, which is history of economic thought and methodology. You were a significant contributor to that literature. Like myself, we started our career half doing our other stuff and half doing that. We also both moved away from it a little bit, but yet it's still in there. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk to the issue of what is the importance of these fields for the trained economists. And do you have any words of advice for young economists entering the discipline that may be drawn to the fields of history of thought and methodology themselves?
Well, yeah, it's a siren call because it's so interesting. It just sucks you in. And you see when you go down the path of methodology and history of thought, you see a richness and complexity of thought that's often lacking in mainstream literature. That's what makes it so seductive. I think it's very healthy to go ahead and answer the siren call, but always, unless you're going to be, a methodologist or a philosopher or a historian of economic thought, and that's just kind of how you define, unless that's your path, you have to always remember that the work that you're doing in methodology and history of thought has to inform current practice. So you've got to keep absolutely forward in your mind. Okay, so what? If you're not just, exclusively focused on history of thought and methodology as your areas of scholarly work, then you've got some other field, some other discipline, some other research project. At every moment, how does what I'm doing in history of thought and methodology inform in some substantive way my other research project? Not how does it show that I'm great and the other people are not so great, but how does it actually change your practice? What does it imply for how you address the mainstream in your chosen field?
Yeah, that's great. I think that either an article had a great influence on me, or it became a justification for that, which is an article by Kenneth Boulding called After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith?
Oh, yes.
And what Boulding argues in there is that we all do, because Smith still speaks to us. He's part of our extended present. And so the idea was history of thought as a part of contemporary theoretical construction. And I think, again, if you go back to your From Crisis to Confidence monograph, the idea of revisiting the missing element in Irving Fisher's very powerful story and then filling that in with another, missing chapter in the history of thought. But to do what? To create this synthesis, which now maybe we can think about going forward, is a perfect example of that. But unless you go and read, what Fisher is actually telling the story, the richness in his story, you miss this element in it, right? And so I think that has been true with your own work, having to do with equilibrium theorizing, expectations, and even you mentioned before Gödel's theorem and stuff. It's interesting you mentioned that. When I was starting graduate school, I think maybe you might have read this book as well, or maybe not, but there was a professor at NYU named Morris Klein, and he's a professor at Courant Institute, and he wrote a book called The Loss of Certainty.
Oh,
and
yes,
it's about
I remember that now.
It's about the beauty of mathematics, actually, but what happens with the evolution of mathematics. And when I was in graduate school, I was very influenced by Austrian economics, so, the idea of studying, formal modeling wasn't at the top of my, priorities. But I had someone very wise who had gone through the process before me say to me, read this Loss of Certainty book. And I read it, and then all of a sudden I started to get amazed by the aesthetics of mathematics and the discipline. And then I kind of was able to juggle that in my head between the two. And I kind of think of you're fascinated by these problems of computability, precisely because it's a very practical issue, no doubt. Like you said, at the end, it puts stopgaps on some of our exercises of flights of fancy. But it also is the beauty of the structure of the argument. And there's something about economics and mathematics that has that, I've always felt like you felt that way too. I've never had that conversation with you, but that there's something beautiful about this.
Oh yeah. And there's also somehow you're kind of making me realize more explicitly than maybe I have in the past. There's something somehow the same here between sort of computability stuff and then the analytical egalitarian stuff, because there's in both this problem of self-reference. So if analytical egalitarianism is meaningful to you, it may be worth the time to really take a dive into computability theory, because even if you don't ever use any of those tools or even refer to them in your own work, it'll make you smarter about self-reference. It'll make you better at analytical egalitarianism, and that's only a good thing.
And also, to go back to the sensory order, it's crucial in the Koppl reading of Hayek to see this baked in at the beginning.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I strongly affirm that. You bet.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why that book becomes so critical. In this sense of the way that we study the world, starting from. Yeah.
That book is I have my read on that book, as you know, is highly Misesian, and I don't really see how people miss that. They think that it's somehow a deviation from Mises or something like that. But he explicitly defends in the concluding philosophical chapter. He explicitly defends Verstehende psychology. That's the exact quote: Verstehende psychology. My apology to anybody who knows actually how to pronounce German words, by the way.
You have to say it to the Lockman.
Yeah, right.
Come on, you can't do it without the Lockman.
It's been retired. So he just couldn't have been more explicit. And then there's other stuff following up on this where he goes back to the same theme. And he connects that to this sort of Cantor Gödel type logic.
Yeah.
And it's explicit in Hayek's work. How people miss it is a bit of a head scratcher to me. I think it's because at some really deep visceral level, we just think that Dilthey, Rickard, and all that Weber and all that understanding tradition is somehow squishy, and math is somehow hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's impossible that the squishy and the hard could exist in the same space. But that, of course, is an error.
I just on this, I want to sort of go on record because you and I have grappled with each other over the sensory order and the way that economists go forward, and it would be wrong to interpret the terms of the debate in which you and I have engaged in as a disagreement on the substantive contributions. It's a debate about the marginal benefits of economists devoting themselves to baking that in versus finding avenues in institutional research.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when in the context, I think, again, this goes back to something that I mentioned earlier. If you go back to the timing at which you and I were wrestling with those ideas against each other, it was at a time when I was coming off the heels in which you have Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, Schleifer, Vishny, and Laporta, and these people. And I was saying, look, on the margin, if you're a young economist and you want to develop sort of Hayek's ideas, you can go in this direction of institutional economics. And you were going in the direction more of the computability kind of idea. I think both of them should be developed and they should be pursued. And in fact, I think there's a link between the two of them. In my book that I'm working on Hayek right now, I argue that Hayek went in two directions after the 30s. One was an institutional turn, which can be seen in The Road to Serfdom, The Constitution of Liberty, and Law, Legislation, and Liberty. But the other one is an epistemic turn, which can be seen in Counter-Revolution and then the various essays having to do. And then that ties into complexity theory. And the key is the connection between the two, actually. And so it's Hayek's epistemic institutionalism. Yeah.
I'll tell you what the connecting concept is. The rule of law.
Yeah.
The rule of law. We need more work on a rule of law approach to macroeconomics, which right now, there's Larry White and not that much else. Yeah. I think my monograph that you said some kind words about also takes a rule of law approach, because the necessity for the role of the significance of the rule of law is entirely a matter of epistemics, of what can be known by whom and how. Right.
Yeah.
So that's exactly the connector.
Yeah, and also then that serves also to tie the expectations in a certain way,
right.
And all of that stuff.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Actually, maybe this will link again. So after your let's move on to this. After your Big Players book, you started studying problems of big players, of what we might call monopoly experts.
Yes.
And you begin with detailed studies of forensics.
Yeah.
Rather than monetary policy, right? This is an interesting twist, different bite of the apple in some sense. What drew your attention to the area of forensic and highlighted the issues you wanted to raise theoretically and practically of monopoly expertise?
I did not choose forensic science. Forensic science chose me. I came across the story of the Olin brothers and their friend who had been wrongly convicted of the rape and murder of the beautiful young Chicago medical student Laura Rochetti. And they got, after having been imprisoned wrongly for this crime, they got a straight DNA exoneration from the Innocence Project. And as I was watching a TV news magazine story about this case, the emphasis, part of the emphasis was on Pamela Fish, the Cook County forensic scientist who had made an error in the original case. And the suggestion of the journalist was that Pamela Fish seemed to be making a lot of errors, and they always seemed to favor the police theory. And I suddenly had, like in the way science happens in the movies and almost never in real life, I suddenly had a flash of insight. I know what the problem is. She's got a monopoly. Mm-hmm. So it turned out later that actually the correct production unit both is the crime lab more than the forensic scientist. So the individual scientist matters and the crime lab matters, but the unit of production, somewhat in an analogy to the firm, it's the crime lab. So that I didn't instantly see when I had this flash of insight. But it just wouldn't leave me alone that we had a problem here that people who favor a kind of market approach to understanding society may not probably be paying that much attention to. But it's a real problem, and it needs attention, and it needs a solution from somebody who's got that kind of a perspective. So I had a sabbatical year coming up, and fortunately it was a full year sabbatical, and I did a dive into forensic science, discovered that there are indeed far more errors in forensic science than you would at first imagine, that it's a big problem, not a small problem, and that at the center of this big problem is monopoly. So that's kind of how it happened. And then the surprise was that it led to a general theory of experts, which links right back to all the original stuff about big players and everything, which is all about, to use Mocklip's words, the production and distribution of knowledge in society.
So you have a new book coming out called Expert Failure. It builds on all of this work, but also goes in different, more varied directions. So it's not just about forensic science. It goes further than that. Tell us a little bit about the book and what you hope to establish with it, and encourage other people to pick up on the loose ends to go further with it.
Yeah, I do feel like the book kind of provides a context for new work that can go in all directions. I mean, I really think it's an enabling thing. I hope that's not just some sort of self-delusion on my part. The core of the book is epistemic, is a vision of how knowledge is produced and distributed in society. Everybody invokes Hayek's great 37 article, Economics and Knowledge, and they are not wrong. But how often is that invocation rather banal? Oh, knowledge is dispersed. Different people know different things. But to really understand why that's not a banal insight, but a deep insight, why that is transformative of social science, is not so easy. So one of the things I do in the book is try to really uncover what Hayek's theory of dispersed knowledge really is, and how we should really understand it, and why it is deep and not trivial. And I think that just drives everything else. I think that's essential to Austrian economics. Without dispersed knowledge, there is no Austrian economics. So I hope that my treatment of knowledge in that book will provide a context for other work on really any problem in social science that you might be looking at. And one of the surprises for me in this book was, before Hayek, there was Mandeville. Hayek has a beautiful essay, Dr. Bernard Mandeville, where he celebrates Mandeville to the hilt, doesn't make the point that Mandeville was there with dispersed knowledge, and in a more radical form, I believe, than Hayek gives us, before Hayek. I don't think he was cheating or fibbing or anything. I think he learned it from Mandeville without knowing that he'd learned it from Mandeville. And then in 1937, when he's in the middle of the socialist calculation debate, up that Mandevillian vision bubbles. And he writes it down in 1937 and thinks, I invented this. I think that's what happened. In any event, I think Mandeville is better than even Hayek on dispersed knowledge. So that's kind of the epistemic foundations. That's why I think it's a book that may speak to anybody grappling with social issues. We have a problem of experts. The administrative state is sort of under attack today. Well, rightly so, I think, because that's the rule of experts. So I wanted to tackle this problem to understand what an expert is. Nobody has defined expert properly, in my view. Everybody defines expert as by their expertise. Right? But the trouble is, we each occupy a different spot in the division of labor. Therefore, each of us has a different spot in the division of knowledge. So each of us has expertise. So everybody's an expert. But if everybody's an expert, nobody's an expert. In an economic theory of experts, an expert is someone paid for their opinion. So it's a contractual role. Not something about what you know and don't know. And that turns out to open up a whole category of economic models that is distinct from principal agent models or asymmetric information models. Okay? And I try to sort of lay that out, pursue that, and show that it has implications in the book. Another thing, if I may be allowed to carry on just another minute, another thing I do in the book, writing the book, I was confronted with the fact that nobody's defined the literature on experts. There's a huge literature on experts. There's a huge literature on experts in science and technology studies. There's a good literature on experts in economics. These guys don't know each other. They don't talk to each other. They don't cite each other. They don't read each other. And not only in those two areas. So philosophy is, of course, being an obvious additional area, philosophy of science and so on. So there's this big problem of experts. A lot of people are talking about it. There's been no definition of the literature. I like to think that in my volume I have sort of defined the contours of that literature, a little bit mapped the territory.
Yeah. I want to go back to a statement that you meant earlier about Mocklup. So you said that Mocklup showed you the shelf.
Yeah.
Right? How high you had to go on the shelf to do that.
Shelf? That's right.
I think that's important because there wasn't that many individuals when we were growing up that had reached the right shelf. So there were some, are the masters of the old ages, right? But the next generation that had the first generation of American Austrians was more content with playing, let's say, a different game.
Yeah.
Right? Which, and in fact, any signal of success in the traditional game, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Mocklup was not discredited, but discounted.
Disparaged,
because he's a president of the American Economic Association. He's the editor of the American Economic Review. He teaches at Princeton and whatnot. He must have sold out, to the old cause or whatever. But that, one of the things that was really great when you and I were first coming into this was we started to have a new generation of demonstration effects. Meaning that Larry White could publish Free Banking in Britain with Cambridge, that Larry could get articles in the American Economic Review, that Rizzo could get articles in the Journal of Law and Economics, and O'Driscoll in the Journal of Political Economy, Garrison in the AER and other places as well. Lavoie, who we didn't mention earlier, but did you overlap with Lavoie at NYU?
I was a student with Don Lavoie at NYU.
Yeah.
Yes. We had no classes together. He was ahead of me, but I am proud to say we were students together.
So he was finishing up probably his dissertation when you were starting.
That's right.
But again, Don, doing that. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about this current line of work is that there's an aspect of what you're doing which has also generated displacement demonstration effect. Your work on epistemology, social epistemology, was in the top journal in the field.
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
And so that all of a sudden says, hey, you could work on these Hayekian ideas and place them in the top journals in the field. In fact, those top journals are begging, for that kind of insight. And, this book is coming out with Cambridge, which is one of the top 3 probably academic publishers. Your work has also received awards that are not given just
not
by
Austrian
our friends.
awards, right?
Yeah, right, by other things. And I'm wondering if you feel that these kind of ideas are, in fact, becoming more accepted within. I'm not saying they're the mainstream, because I agree with you about the DSGE model. Everyone predicted the downfall of macroeconomics. We're beating our chests. We're begging before the Queen. We're going up to Congress and saying sorry, and then nothing changes right in the way we do things. Right. That's a different story, right? And yet people have invested a lot trying to say that economics is terrible, but yet we still, 96% of economists, after they have their PhD within 6 months, have a job. No other discipline has that kind of but there is a kind of idea where you're part of a conversation that an earlier generation might not have ever imagined they could be part of. And I wanted you to, do you think that's true? Or do you think that there's something missing in that story?
Well, I mean, are you playing the long game or the short game? There is now an opportunity to get in the conversation. The conversation isn't going to get turned on its head in the next 5 years. So if what you want to do is like publish in the AER in the next 5 years, well, okay, that's a challenge. It's possible. We have examples. You listed some. So it's a worthy goal. Okay. But it's a challenge. But you can exist, do a sort of Austrian research program, and have a voice. Now, what about the long run? Well, it's very important to keep these ideas alive, to keep this alternative vision alive, that it be a real economic tradition and not just some dusty old tomes from the 19th century, so that when the moment comes, as I would say, unfortunately it will, those ideas are ready to hand. Now, what do you mean, unfortunately? Wouldn't that be a great idea if Austrian economics is on top? Well, yeah, except the events in the world that would make that possible are not events we want, because we're talking about catastrophic institutional failure. It's going to provide the opening for Austrian economics to be back on top of the academic discourse. So that's sort of a prospect to dread, but it's also a prospect that we had very well better prepare for, because the world will need us at that moment.
Yeah, I decided to do my Southern address in the fall is going to be on public administration and transformation of economics. And it will be very influenced by Vincent Ostrom's work on the intellectual crisis of public administration, but also David Levy's work and Sandra Pert, as well as your work, on how it is that when we move to this idea of economics moving away from a discipline of social understanding to a discipline of social control, and therefore then the establishment of monopoly experts, which in fact independent regulatory agencies are designed to be, and you need to staff them with things, that transforms economics, because you have a supply and demand function of economics, and you got to look at like what that was doing. And for that system, like Vincent Ostrom talked about, the intellectual crisis of American public administration, for that system of public administration to reach a point of crisis is not going to be a happy moment. Right? I mean,
right.
in the actual real world, it will be a kind of very difficult moment, and that's a hard thing to sort of go. To some extent, we're seeing the fraying of aspects of that already, and maybe we'll see more of it, but I don't view it as a good thing. I was just asked a question in an interview earlier this morning whether or not I saw anything optimistic in the recent election in the United States, and for the kind of society that I like. And I wanted to be crystal clear rather than like murky at all. And so I actually said, no, in like capital letters, no. There's nothing, about the current system that I find, desirable. In fact, I view the rise of right-wing kind of populist authoritarianism to be a very sad moment. But I agree with you that in the midst of that, certain ideas need to be on the table just so that they're out there. But then if we go back to our analytical egalitarian, or the way David and Sandra call it, the rational choice theorist rather than rational choice theory, that the rational choice theorist, we got to bake that into the beginning of this transition idea too. So, but
Vincent Ostrom and Eleanor Ostrom are a great example, because they were doing Virginia political economy, but in the field of public administration. So it's very important that these ideas live in more than one home, not only in economics, but in public administration, and I would say in entrepreneurial studies. And one of the pluses in entrepreneurial studies is that entrepreneurs are not experts. Right. There's no call for from within entrepreneurial studies for the rule of experts.
Right. To have an entrepreneurial council.
Yeah.
Right. Council of Entrepreneurial Advisors.
I mean, some of these guys actually think that way. They want that. But the overall, the discipline is not appointed that way. So it gives more breathing room for analytical egalitarianism to inform your analysis.
Yeah. I just was on a dissertation at Darden at the entrepreneurship, and one of the a couple of the leading practitioners in the field are on the faculty there, and it was a fantastic opportunity to interact with them and to learn from them in a wonderful environment. University of Virginia is one of the top business schools, but it also seemed like it was completely a breath of fresh air, the opportunity for young people if they want to go in the field of entrepreneurship. And I think this should be a big selling point. I don't want to turn this into an advertisement for your program that you're starting with Maria, but I do think it's a great opportunity, and Syracuse is, arguably the top or one of the top entrepreneurship programs, and so the opportunity that could exist up there for young scholars to enter into this field with a leg up and make real contributions is a serious thing. Maybe a few words about what you have going on there and your plans?
Well, we have the Institute for an Entrepreneurial Society. It is the so-called Triple E department, the entrepreneurship department at Syracuse, is indeed a top department in the field. And we have the Institute, and one of the things the Institute does is bring in PhD students, funds them. It's a pretty good ride, as the lingo has it. It's a pretty generous package we offer our students. And the faculty at the Institute for an Entrepreneurial Study are very clear that the student has to follow his own course. He has to follow his own path. He doesn't have a choice. But the faculty, we have a clear Kersnerian vision of entrepreneurial theory. So it's Kersner. And then for applied research, we also have a clear vision. There's this emerging, growing field of entrepreneurship policy. And what's missing largely from that literature is Virginia political economy, is the public choice toolbox. So we have a vision of bringing that public choice toolbox, that Virginia political economy vision, to the field of entrepreneurship policy.
Oh, that's fantastic. What a great opportunity, and I hope many people pursue that. I do think that this literature in the political economy of entrepreneurship is a very fresh area. I have a couple of these new centers have been popping up in various different places, and I've always thought that one of the problems is we always just think of it in terms of economics, and we should be thinking in terms of political economy kind of programs in business schools, like the way Stanford has as homes for people, and entrepreneurship would be a great avenue in here. And there are, programs, starting at Syracuse, but also Baylor and also Oklahoma State. And as I said, the people at Darden are very open to this. And Maryland is starting a new program. And
Maryland's very important.
And American is going to just start it's called Center for Innovation. So very, very excited about these things and where this literature and these opportunities go. Before we go, I was hoping I could ask you maybe your reflections on our program. You spent time here this year in the Hayek program, and you've had the opportunity to visit with many of our graduate students and participate in various discussion groups and seminars. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts to share with us about what we might be doing right, what we should strive to do better as we go forward, and just general impressions of how we're developing our program here.
Pete, if you're looking to me to criticize what's going on with the Mercatus Center, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's a great place. It's really a wonderful place to be. If you get the opportunity to visit, as I have this year, grab it. What do you have? I mean, it's a beautiful physical facility, and you have very important names around. And what you have is a community of scholars, starting from highly established, very important senior scholars to sort of associate professor type and assistant, down to PhD students and master students. So you have sort of all the levels there of people inquiring in sort of complementary but distinct research programs and perspectives, interested in ideas. I mean, you walk through the students have their carols, and you see all these books stacked up, and little tags coming out of the books, and it's fabulous. This is a place of ideas. This is a place where ideas are exciting, and this is a place where people work hard on exciting ideas. It's just a great place to be. I love it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Roger, and it's been amazing to have you here this year, and I'm looking forward to more collaborations and the great success and follow-ups to your work on expert failures and what your next project is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.